Okay, hi everyone. I am Amber. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a software engineer on the PowerShell team. I'm going to be talking about how to use Azure Container Registries with PSResourceGet. So of course, just want to thank all of our sponsors. I also just wanted to give a shout out to everyone who helped organize this conference and put everything together. I know it's a lot of work and I really appreciate all the effort that went into it, and that I get to be here talking to you all today. So a little about me. Like I said, I'm a software engineer on the PowerShell team. I primarily work on PSResourceGet and the PowerShell gallery, kind of the client to server side experience of using and managing PowerShell packages. I've spent the last few years really focusing on the technical debt of PowerShell Get specifically, and then also the gallery. This is my first time at PSConfEU. At least in person. I did do a virtual talk with Sydney Smith, one of the PowerShell PMs in 2020. And that was on PSResourceGet when it was still in its infancy. So I'm really excited to be back here and to actually be here in person. If you want to reach out to me, I'm not super active on Twitter. I do have a Twitter account. I am always on GitHub, so it's better to reach out to me there, especially if there's anything specific to a particular project. But Twitter also works. So I actually just wanted to gauge really quickly how familiar folks are with PSResourceGet. How many folks actually use PSResourceGet or have used it? Okay, awesome. And then what about PowerShell Get? Okay, cool. So just a quick background for everyone. PSResourceGet is the new and improved package manager for PowerShell. We actually just GA'd last October. We now ship inbox with PowerShell 7.4 and above. It is compatible with Windows PowerShell 5.1, but we aren't inbox in there quite yet. So you'll still need to manually install if you do use Windows PowerShell. PSResourceGet is a rewrite of PowerShell Get. So for a little bit of context, PowerShell Get versions 2x and below, we actually refer to as PowerShell Get v2. PowerShell Get versions 3x and above is actually a completely different module with the exact same name. And this is a compatibility layer that's meant to map the syntax of PowerShell Get v2 with the underlying functionality of PSResourceGet. And this module is meant to be a transition tool to help users who have scripts in the PowerShell Get v2 syntax help them just quickly use PSResourceGet, the functionality of PSResourceGet. Yes, go ahead.
So when I'm in 7.4, I actually do hit the new modules every time, no matter what I do.
Yes, with PowerShell, yes. So we actually do have the compatibility layer in 7.4 as well. So it's automatically just going to use that new syntax. So you can, reinstall the old version if you would prefer to use that, but it's automatically just going to use the new one. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we have PSResourceGet, which is what we're just trying to move all of our users onto. As a side note, too, if you have any questions about the versioning and the naming of this module and kind of the transitioning of it, feel free to ask in the Q&A or reach out to me after this session. Sydney actually did delve into this a little bit at last year's conference. I don't know if anyone saw that talk. But I'm more than happy to kind of explain our reasoning and what we were doing and receive any feedback if anyone has suggestions on how we could have done that better. So we talked a little bit about PSResourceGet. What's Azure Container Registry? ACR is actually a managed registry that's based on the open source Docker registry. So if you've used Docker before, it's probably familiar. To put it simply, ACR just allows you to store and manage container images and OCI artifacts in a public or private registry. You can actually interact with ACR using Docker. You can use AZ commandlets. There's a bunch of other client-side tools, and now you can also use PSResourceGet. So I just wanted to talk about some overloaded terms before we continue. Repositories in ACR actually refers to something a little bit different than repositories in PSResourceGet. In PSResourceGet, repository refers to the file exchange or the server or whatever it is that's actually hosting your packages. In ACR, repositories refers to the artifact that's actually uploaded to your registry. So you can think of registries in ACR as essentially equivalent to repositories in PSResourceGet, and repositories in ACR is essentially equivalent to the concept of a package in PSResourceGet. And then the second overloaded term that we have is tags. So a tag in PSResourceGet refers to the keyword or the label that authors can assign to their modules to categorize and describe the content. And it's meant to help with the discovery and understanding more about the context of a package. In ACR, the label is actually used to identify a specific version of an artifact. So tags are part of the naming convention, and it just allows you to manage and version and differentiate between the different iterations of an artifact. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick demo of what ACR looks like in the Azure portal. And this is actually the test registry for the PSResourceGet CI/CD pipeline. We have a bunch of different things that we can do to configure the registry. I'm going to go into some of that a little bit later. Just going over the basics right now. In repositories, let's see, we have all of our packages here. I will say everything in ACR is lowercase. Obviously, that doesn't matter in PowerShell, but here it's always going to be stored lowercase. And then I'm going to look for this particular package. And we have the different versions just listed under tags here. I'm going to click on this one. And this is the manifest for the artifact. Again, if you are familiar with Docker images, you do have layers. We only have one layer. This is just going to be a layer for the nupkeg itself. We have the SHA digest here. This is going to be how PSResourceGet actually pulls the nupkeg. And then under annotations here, this is all PSResourceGet generated content. Metadata in particular might look familiar to some of you. This is actually the module manifest metadata or the metadata that's at the beginning of a script that just gets stored in that property. And essentially, this is everything that PSResourceGet needs in order to understand that like an artifact in ACR is indeed a PowerShell package. And one thing that I'll make note of here really quickly is that a package or an artifact has to be pushed by PSResourceGet in order for PSResourceGet to be able to see it on the server and actually like interact and install it. And that is because of this metadata specifically that it's looking for. So just wanted to make note of that. Even though there are a bunch of other client tools that you can use, you have to use PSResourceGet for PowerShell packages. Okay, and then jumping back to the slides. Okay, so why ACR? Why are we doing all this integration with ACR? Basically, public package repositories have always kind of been the wild, wild west. I don't think anyone takes security lightly, but in the last couple of years or so, there's been growing concerns in the industry with strengthening security, preventing against supply chain attacks, and things of that nature. As you can imagine, a public package repository is a risk vector. The PowerShell gallery started off being a place where folks could store and share their modules with the community, but it's actually since grown into a service that a lot of CI/CD pipelines rely on, a lot of production code relies on. None of the packages on the gallery are inherently trusted. It's up to the user to kind of do their due diligence. So ACR really comes in as a way to provide peace of mind. It's meant to provide a secure, private, and isolated repository for package. I mentioned that you can do some neat things with ACR. You can add webhooks to get notifications for activity like artifact pushes and pulls and deletions. You can enforce rules on your registry, like that only certain types of artifacts are stored. You can enable geo-replication so that your registry exists across multiple regions, and that just helps to increase availability and reduce latency. But I'm going to dig in on a couple of things specifically, the authentication and the security side of things, because there's a lot going on there. ACR does support Azure Active Directory, and through AAD, you can actually do role-based access control, use role-based access control to manage who can access the registry and what actions can be performed. So this applies to individual users and to service principals. You can also use managed identities for authenticating to ACR, and this is really, really great if you're using other Azure services like functions, VMs, or Azure Kubernetes service, because it's able to securely pull the artifacts without actually having to manage credentials. And security-wise, ACR can be configured with virtual network rules, which just allows you to limit access to the registry so that traffic is limited to specific VNets and not traveling through the public internet. You can also define IP-based firewall rules to restrict access to the registry to specific IP ranges. And one of the coolest things, in my opinion, is that ACR has built-in integration with Defender for Cloud. So that just allows you to easily scan artifacts for vulnerabilities. There's actually two different kinds of triggers. There's a one-time trigger. So if you push an artifact or import an artifact to your registry, it can trigger a one-time scan. There's also continuous scanning. So if you're updating your scans, it'll rescan anything that's already been scanned just to make sure that it's still safe and compliant and like up to date with the latest checks. So all of this really just helps to keep your packages secure, compliant, and safe in a really trustworthy way. So we did just release a preview version that has ACR integration last month, and that's version 1.10 preview 1. We do have full support for modules, scripts, and DSC resources. We currently only have support for ACR, and I'll kind of jump back to this a little bit later in the talk. But we do actually have functionality to work against Microsoft Artifact Registry, which is essentially Microsoft's public container registry. So we do have client-side functionality for that. There aren't any PowerShell packages published there yet. I'll actually get back to this a little bit later in the talk as well. Okay, so now I'm just going to demo kind of the end-to-end full experience of using ACR with PSResourceGet. And then I do have the latest preview version installed, just showing you right there. And I will also say that I have, well, I can just show you, I have the latest AZ commandlets installed. I need the AZ modules because I'm going to be doing this demo through PowerShell. You don't need the AZ commandlets, the modules, if you're doing things through the portal, which you can do. There's more configurations that you have to do if you're creating an ACR registry through the portal. I think it's a lot easier to just do it through PowerShell. So I'm going to show it that way. And this is also a PowerShell conference. So the first thing that we need to do is we actually need to sign into Azure. We're going to use Connect AZ account. And I'm just going to use that default subscription. And then we need a resource group to stick our ACR instance into. So I'm just going to create a new resource group. And then we can actually create our registry. So new AZ Container Registry. And with this, we're just going to use the resource group that we just created as one of the parameters. Our SKU, I'm just choosing a basic SKU. You can do whatever you like. Again, location, West Europe, just whatever's closest. Okay, and this takes a few seconds to actually create. Okay, there we go. So we're actually going to use the login server to register the registry as a PSResourceGet repository. So we'll just do register PSResource repository. The URI is going to be the URL of the ACR instance. That's just the login server with https://. Just going to register this as a trusted repository because it's a private registry. So we can just do get PS resource repository, and I'm just going to show you, I just wanted to show you really quickly that we do have this new API version, which is Container Registry. It needs to be Container Registry in order to understand that it's interacting with a Container Registry. Please don't change that. It is a configurable setting, but don't change that unless you need to. Let's see. Okay, so now we can actually, let's create some packages to publish. I am actually going to create a package that has a dependency. So I'm going to start off by doing this parent module. And yes, I'm going to do new module manifest with the file name, description, and then most importantly, required modules. And it's going to have this dependency that is child module. And then we'll create that. We'll create that module as well. Okay, and that's just a simple,
Nothing new here, right?
Nothing new here. This is exactly the same, yes. And unfortunately, let's remove this. Okay, meant to do this. Okay, there we go. Yeah, nothing new with actually creating the modules. Then we can actually publish our modules to ACR. So I'm just going to start with the child module.
Is the dependency already important, or is it just that you just upload the child module first?
The order, so actually, yes and no. So right now the order is important, but you can actually publish and you can add this parameter skip dependencies check. Yeah, so by default, it will check to see if the dependency is already available in the repository. But if you run this, it'll just push regardless. So that option is available. Then we'll publish the parent module. Okay, then if we jump to the ACR instance, let's find it here. Did get created, and then we have our packages here. And we can just test that with PSResourceGet. We'll do a find PS resource. I'm just going to look for the parent module and include dependencies. Okay, and then we can install it. Install. Wrong repository. Okay, there we go. Okay, and then let's just do a get PS resource to make sure that it actually properly did get installed. And we have both of the modules there. So that's kind of like the full experience, the publishing, the pulling to and from ACR. And if we jump back to the slides, go ahead.
So the repository you just created is publicly available, or is it because you're signed in right now?
That is just because I'm signed in right now. So you can make it, that one is not publicly available, but you can configure it to be publicly available. Yes. So now I just wanted to go into a little bit of a deep dive and talk about the process of writing all of this and just give a little bit of insight into what was going on there. When we started off, we were actually using ACR REST API endpoints to make simple calls and see if we could get the functionality that we needed. In our investigations, we actually found out that there's already a client-side tool called ORAS that allows for interaction with OCI artifacts. ORAS stands for OCI Registry as Storage. That was exactly what we were looking for. In fact, the tool was made to help developers actually build their own clients on top of their libraries. But unfortunately, PowerShell and PSResourceGet rely on .NET, and they didn't have .NET support available. So that kind of gave us two options. We could either wait for them to provide that support, or we could write everything ourselves. We actually decided to just write everything ourselves, but we would write it in such a way where we could easily remove our code and plug in ORAS whenever they do a release for .NET. And the last that we heard, it's still in their backlog, but still likely not happening for a while. One of the reasons why we wanted to use ORAS to begin with, other than not having to write everything from scratch, is that they provide support for other types of container registries, like Amazon's Elastic Container Registry. So at a high level, that kind of shaped a lot of how we structured this implementation. And probably one of the most fundamental components that we had to figure out was the handling of tokens. So with ACR, you do have a concept of access tokens and refresh tokens, and both are integral to authenticating to the registry. They're two separate kinds of tokens. An access token is used to authenticate API requests to ACR, and it grants access to the resource specified within the token scope. They're short-lived. They typically expire anywhere between a few minutes to an hour. And this actually limits the window that the token can be used if it's compromised. The second kind of token is a refresh token, which is used to get a new access token without requiring re-authentication to AAD. So it just allows for continuous access without repeatedly prompting for credentials. Refresh tokens do have a longer lifespan. It's typically like days, weeks, even months. But they can be configured to expire or to be revoked. So when an access token expires, a refresh token is actually sent to the authentication server to request a new access token. And this process just allows for a seamless and secure way of obtaining new tokens, and also ensures that your tokens are consistently being rotated. So how this gets applied in PSResourceGet is that we use AAD to authenticate. We get the Azure Access Token, we get the refresh token, and then we determine what the scope should be. And we get a new access token for the registry. And that last access token is the one that we actually use to interact with our artifacts. And all of this is obfuscated from the user. PSResourceGet actually uses the Azure Identity Library to get the first access token. So if you're already logged in, it'll just work. If you're not logged in, you'll be prompted through a UI authentication flow. You can also store your access tokens in a vault in secret management. And I think that's less ideal because you have to manage everything yourself. But if you want more control over your access tokens or want to manage it in a very specific way, that's always an option. So with PSResourceGet, at this point, we're able to use the headers to get the properties that we need from the artifact, like the manifest, the layer, the SHA digest. You saw some of that earlier when I was showing the manifest in the portal. And then we just make the calls to get the pull that we need. So that's the basic idea behind finding and installing. The design for publishing was a little bit trickier because of one component, and that's dependencies. So ACR treats dependencies a little bit differently than how PSResourceGet treats dependencies. So PSResourceGet will have a parent package that lists all of its children, and those children, of course, in turn can have their own children recursively. But ACR has this concept called refers, where the artifact actually points to its parent. So for a package manager, that's pretty chaotic. That would mean we would have to go to every single package and say, are you my parent? Are you my parent? So though we wanted to use the concept of refers because it's more container registry-ish, it didn't really work for us for the context that we needed. the concept of refers is kind of equated to dependencies, but it's actually meant more for things like SBOMs, like software bill of materials, security scanning results, and things like that. And that wasn't really quite what we needed. So we did try out a few different ways to manage dependencies, but the simplest thing ended up being just adding the dependency to the metadata that's in the manifest. And when the manifest gets read client side, we just parse out the dependencies, get the package versions that we need. It's pretty simple, pretty efficient. So I mentioned earlier that we do have client-side support for MAR, but right now there aren't any PowerShell packages published there. We are working internally with Microsoft Teams to get first-party packages pushed there. And actually, the AZ modules will start publishing there using PSResourceGet in July. So that's really exciting for us. When that happens, there's a feature in ACR called Cache, where you can actually create a rule to pull from an upstream source. And MAR is one of the upstream sources, so you'll be able to just pull in first-party modules to your registry super easily. I also mentioned earlier that ORES provides support for other container registries. That was something that we were hoping to inherit by using ORES. But regardless of whether we actually do end up using it or not, we still want to eventually expand on the types of container registries that we support. That's more of a long-term goal. We'll kind of see how things go with ACR first. And in general, we want to also expand on the types of packages that PSResourceGet supports. So very high up on that priority list is full NUPKEG support. And by full NUPKEG, I mean a generic NUPKEG package, anything that is not a PowerShell package. But in terms of container registries specifically, OCI artifacts are generic enough that we could potentially provide support for tar-GZs and other types of files. Let's see. Yeah, so that's also more of a long-term goal that we have. If there's like anything in particular that you would like to see, feel free to let us know. And lastly, our key takeaways, why you should care about all this. Security has always been important. It's increasingly becoming more and more critical. So what can you do to be more secure? Of course, there's the basics. Staying up to date on releases can help mitigate risks from vulnerabilities. But specifically, moving off of PowerShell Get and onto PSResourceGet can help you take advantage of new ways to be more secure. I mentioned earlier that we have PowerShell Get 3.0 that acts as a compatibility module. But within PSResourceGet, we actually also have this new commandlet called import PSGet repository. And that just takes all of the repositories that you have registered for PowerShell Get v2, and it adds them to PSResourceGet. So we're basically doing what we can to try to help users migrate from PowerShell Get v2 to PSResourceGet. And another way that you can be more secure is to use container registries. So container registries in general provide more privacy, strong security, highly controlled ways to authenticate. It allows you to curate and better control your modules on top of ensuring that your modules are safe through security scanning. So all of this is just meant to create a safe and secure end-to-end experience with using PowerShell packages in production and on your dev box. And that's it. I'll open it up to Q&A.
Hello, first question. Do you intend long-term maybe to get out of Maggot servers?
Yes, I think yes. Yes. I think in general, we are trying to think of more long-term strategies specifically for the PowerShell gallery to provide more security and safety, especially considering kind of the lack of resources that we have to continue development on the PowerShell gallery. So not that there's any plans to deprecate it, but just we're thinking of ways on how we can provide better security for users.
Second one, finally. do you think that you could extend the support? So you said it, but do you think that you could extend the support of the type of the registries that you will support? Currently, it's just ACR, maybe for on-prem container registries, for example?
Yes, definitely. Yes. That's something that like I think is a very like logical next step. Yeah.
So I'm thinking stuff like Proget, Nexus, Artifactory, for example.
Yeah.
Just to list them. Currently, we are consuming private modules through Nugget, and honestly, sometimes it's a bit of a nightmare. Especially with Artifactory.
Yeah.
And typically, Artifactory is also supporting container registries. So if we could move from one to the other, and it works, I would be happy to do those kind of move.
Yeah. I will also say, sometimes it's hard for us to know what like specific user situations are like. So I would absolutely love if you are able to like kind of open up an issue on PSResourceGet and just explain what your scenario is like and where your pain points are. Like that would really help us just know what people are doing, what they're using, what their scenarios are like. And it helps us significantly. We love that kind of stuff. Yeah, that would be great.
There was a specific bit of properties in the container registry that you were probably going to come back to. I don't know if you can probably use the time to see.
Yeah. What were you thinking of?
Well, there was something about with the webhooks and stuff like that. There were a few.
Oh, yes. Yes. Okay. So I was talking about some of that, but didn't really show. Yeah. So I was just kind of listing through it, but didn't really show how you can do it. But this is just literally where you can add some of the configurations that I was talking about. Yeah. So I was mentioning that you can, add webhooks here for specific things that you want to add to it. And then here's just the geo-replication that I was talking about. So these are all just things that depending on what you want to do, you can configure specific like properties or scenarios.
Where's actually the policy for the one-time refresh, or just how do you do that bit of caching for the what was it?
Are you talking about like pulling from an upstream source?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's actually here under this cache, and you would just create a rule. And then you can see, let's see. Yeah. So here you have different upstream sources. I assume they're going to also be continuing to expand on the sources that you can pull from. But this is kind of what I was talking about. You can pull from MAR. And then you can first go to MAR, just like find whatever packages or images are there that you want to pull. And then you can pull specific images.
Can you also pin it to certain versions?
Oops. Yes.
Are you able to also pin that to specific versions from this?
That is a good question. I assume that you can. I haven't actually tried that yet, especially because we don't have any PowerShell packages yet. So haven't really been able to test that experience and see like what it is like you can and cannot do. But I would assume so. Yes, I would assume so.
It's also in the Azure Container Registry and not in the PowerShell part of it. Yeah,
that's true.
I have a bunch of colleagues that are ops guys and maybe not 100% PowerShell users. They often ask me, okay, so how do I keep up to date? And it's a kind of a mess explaining to them, oh, so you don't want to use 5.1 or you should go to 7.4, but why should they do it? And how should they keep their AC modules up to date? It's just... Yeah. Kind of hairy to explain it to them, and I'm not really sure when the new Get PS resource is the way to point those guys. Yeah, I think it really depends on the situation. Again, if there's something that
if there's a reason why they're not able to move on to PSResourceGet, like that's something we should definitely know about, because we want to encourage users to kind of like move on to, you know, like PowerShell Get 7.4 and like PSResourceGet, just because if there's issues, we can fix those issues in the latest releases there, and then kind of continue to provide extensibility. If there's new features and stuff that are requested. But
it usually boils down to stupid small things, like they start installing in their own workspace. So OneDrive fucks up because of a million files from AC.
Yeah.
And they install it to all users' context. And then at some point they have 3 versions of AC modules or all modules installed, and they have no clue what module they actually are using when they're using the shell. And they end up using both 5.1 and 7.4 next to each other, and they can't figure out why stuff works differently. That's minor details, but it's hard to explain. And it's like, start over, delete everything, clean up, go again. But it's always hard when you end up there. Right?
Yeah. And I will also say that I think sometimes, like at least in my experience, it can be tricky when you have both like Windows PowerShell and PowerShell installed, because there are different module paths. I personally am kind of invested in improving the module path experience. So that's something that like we're trying to work with .NET because of specific functionality that we need from them, and kind of work on trying to standardize things within PowerShell so that also in PSResourceGet, we can have a much better experience, because I think this has been a pain point for a lot of people, just like the module path experience more generally speaking. And then what makes it worse is that there's like different module paths for Windows PowerShell. So it's like, if you have both installed, now you've got like all of these different, like, you know, local user, admin user, and both of these different systems. So it's kind of chaotic. I'm not sure what to say to improve that experience, like right this moment.
So just a very quick question. So I think this is all incredible and is really useful, at least for my company. However, you've mentioned it's in preview. I suppose, what would be the timescales for it to be, let's say, GA?
That's a good question. We don't ever really have like specific, I'll say like specific like metrics for moving from like preview to GA. Most of it honestly is like users using it. So if we get like feedback that people are actually using it, then we're like a little bit more confident, oh, we can move this to GA. If it feels like people aren't using it, we'll generally leave it in preview for a longer period so that we can get more feedback before we actually move to GA. Yeah.
Just to follow up on this question, would you recommend using it in a semi-production environment already?
Yes, I would. Definitely. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
And then if you have issues, please feel free to open them and we can get on that so that GA is a good experience. Because we also don't want to move something into GA and then people feel like they can use it in production and then it like breaks their production pipeline. We don't, want to cause that kind of like headache and stuff. So. Doing on time. Oh. Okay. Is that any more questions? Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you all.